Here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Well, howdy, folks. My name is Lester Ryan Clark.
And I'm Keenan Diaz.
And we're the hosts of The Exorcist Minute, a show where we examine, extrapolate, and excavate the scariest movie of all time.
Each episode covers a single minute of William Friedkin's 1973 horror masterpiece, The Exorcist.
If you like deep dives, this show is the deepest.
Did you know the film's iconic theme song, Tubular Bells, wasn't written specifically for the movie?
Or that the 1973 audience members were throwing up and fainting in the theater before they ever got a glimpse of the demon?
Or what about all the crazy on-set mishaps, cast injuries, the director firing real guns?
Ooh. Ever wonder where Ouija boards came from or how they got their name? How about some history on the Catholic Church or the Roman rite of exorcism? Or maybe we can tempt you with some juicy demonology lore. Did you know that Pazuzu had an ex-wife? Find The Exorcist Minute on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to your shows or at theexorcistminute.com. Until next time, folks,
the power of The Exorcist compels you.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, if you've listened to pretty much any time myself and Paul Hoppe have talked, you've probably heard that poker is a big part of our lives. It's been Paul's primary form of income for a number of years. It's been mostly my hobby, but at times my primary form of income at various points in times. But more even than that, it has shaped a lot of the way that Paul and I talk about things. And then I think, at least for me, and I think somewhat for Paul, a lot of how we understand the world. It, of course, also comes up from time to time in some of our favorite stories and TV shows and movies, sometimes portrayed well, sometimes, well, not. So we're going to be discussing that today, and we're not as much going to talk about poker on screen, although we'll definitely reference it. We're more going to be talking about what poker can help you understand about the world and about things like probability and uncertainty, and why, at least for me, why I think that is such an important issue that does come up in the stories we talk about so much today. So, Paul, why don't you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your background with poker?
Hi, I'm Paul Christopher Hoppe, aka Zen Madman, formerly known as Giant Buddha in poker circles. I have been playing poker since I was a kid, actually. There was literally a Nintendo game called Casino Kid. And I rocked that, and it was basically you go around and you play like 5-card draw and blackjack against like 5 different dealers each, and you have to bust them. And that's how I learned poker when I was like probably 11 or 12 or something. Which
that sounds right.
I think is funny because, you know, it's like people think of gambling as like 18 and up, 21 and up and whatever. And I think for serious sums of money, that's reasonable. But I think the certain fundamentals behind gambling and wagering, I think, are actually fundamental to understanding reality and decision making in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, in high school, we played some of those wild card games, you know. Yep. And then shortly after high school, Rounders came out, and I saw the preview. Actually, the movie didn't even come out. I saw the preview and was like, I'm going to do that. And you know, I was living on my own in New York City in Manhattan and was playing live poker and supporting myself doing that. And which seems like a ridiculous thing unless you know what my rent was, which was not standard New York City rent. But you know, I did that for a while, and then I played some online poker, but kind of went away from poker when the poker boom happened in like 2003, came back to it in 2006. And played super seriously from like 2006 until 12, I'd say. Like that was my primary to only source of income. I then did various poker related things. Like I wrote some poker books. I made a lot of coaching videos. I coached individual students. And, you know, a lot of my life was around poker at the time. This was right after I stopped teaching martial arts full time. And then I kind of went away from poker and kind of came in and out. But I did work at a casino actually for 1.5 years and had almost every job in the poker room, including one that they didn't previously have, which was actually you play on your own money, but on certain hours to help keep games going. And then, you know, now I play primarily online poker, but I enjoy all forms of the game. And I would say that, you know, poker really informs so much of my worldview to the point where I think there's only like maybe a couple other things that are on a similar level in terms of sort of how they've affected how I view the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I can totally see that. I think that's going to be the meat of what we talk about today. For me, I had kind of a similar start. I didn't play the Nintendo game, but my mother taught me poker at an early age. We played for matchsticks. And her idea of it was, she didn't want me necessarily to be a gambler, but, in the world she had grown up with and that she was part of as a professional. She was a lawyer at a time when it was still pretty new for women to be lawyers, especially she was one of the first women to go to Yale. She was one of the first women to go to Columbia Law School. And in her mind, it was, look, you're going to get invited to poker nights. It's a social thing that people do. It's a good game to know. And I've had kind of a very different journey around poker with Paul, but one that's often intersected in that for me, as Paul said, there are many different reasons to play poker. For me, it has always primarily been a way to have fun. I was part of the high school games that Paul talked about. Many things will not be said about because in case any law enforcement agents are listening to this. No, it wasn't that bad. But, and I really loved those. I started poker nights in college. At various points in my adult life, I've had a regular, Tuesday night, friends come over to play poker. And for me, it has actually served a very similar role in my life as friends come over to play D&D or friends come over to play Magic the Gathering or a board game night. It is a way for friends to come together where the money was a way of helping making it interesting and creating stakes so that people weren't just, going crazy all the time. But it was never really about the money. As I said, I have had times where poker has helped supplement my income. One point about 6 months where it was my entire income, but I just didn't have the skill level to really sustain that for that much longer than that. It's been a little more than 6 months, but various points in my life. But for the most, at one point when Paul and I were talking about doing a poker podcast or a poker website of different kinds, I would always refer to myself as the poker hobbyist because for me that's what I've always loved, and so I love going to a casino. Last week, actually, I was at a casino in Philadelphia, and I wound up playing 6 hours of poker and losing a total of $4 because I went down and then I went back up and then I went down and up and I didn't look at it as, oh no, I had a terrible night, I lost $4. I looked at it as I just had 6 hours of great entertainment at a casino and paid 75 cents an hour. And that was, to me, and we also count in the drinks I was getting and the water and the, all of it. It was worth it. It was a good price to pay.
It's hard to find entertainment at that price these days.
Yes, especially in a casino or something like that, Try going to downtown Vegas and find some way to entertain yourself for a better price.
Yeah, or better yet, don't.
No, exactly.
Because I'm sure there's ways, but I'm not going to necessarily recommend those.
But certainly I think, as you mentioned, and I think this is mostly from you, but also from a lot of my own observances, I have found how much poker has also helped me to understand life a lot better. And I don't think that it's this is not, poker is the key to enlightenment by any means. It's that I think there are a lot of things in the world that people really struggle with, or that and I think especially the writers and the characters of the stories we love often have trouble with, around understanding probability and also understanding uncertainty, chaos, if you want to call it that. That feels very relevant. And I think that's kind of what we're wanting to talk about today. And, I think this is a topic that can get a little self-helpy, and we don't mean it like that. But I do think that there's some elements of, especially in this, probability and polls and statistics are becoming very important conversations in our world today. And I know it's something that Paul and I have a lot of strong feelings about. And so that's certainly going to be an area of focus. But this isn't about, trying to say you should live your lives the way we do. Definitely don't live your life the way I do. But just about giving you some other ideas of how to think about these things, and particularly in terms of the stories and the characters, and also in our own world.
Yeah, and I mean, I would maybe say I do mean some things in a little bit of a self-helpish sort of way, just in terms of I think one of the biggest lessons. I don't know exactly where you want to start off, but
go for it.
I think one of the biggest lessons, if not the biggest, is that, you can't control everything through your actions, right? In poker and in life, it makes sense. It behooves you to try to make the best decisions you can, right?
Right.
With the information you have available at the time. You can't think about you should have made a different decision with some information you didn't possess or weren't able to acquire. And then the outcome, like the better your decisions are, on average, you'll get better outcomes. But there are also many things that are outside of your control, right? And
Right.
in poker, it's what cards you get dealt, what cards come out after your initial cards are dealt, how your opponents respond to your bets, what cards they get dealt. And these, you can't control these things. And
Right.
so there has to be an acceptance of, I'm just going to try and make good decisions, take good actions, given the information I have, and then the outcomes will be what they are. And if I keep making good decisions, the better my decisions are, on average, the better my outcomes will be. But
Right.
that doesn't mean a piano won't fall on my head, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, if you're walking in the forest, a piano probably won't fall on your head. But like,
A tree might.
a tree might. Exactly. That might be more likely than a piano falling on your head anywhere than outside a piano throwing place. I don't know. There's some game show where they like throw a piano off a conveyor belt or something. And like if you're standing down there, you actually have a pretty high probability of having a piano land on your head. But so I would recommend like don't stand there, right? But I mean, overall, the main point just being like, there's things you can control and there's things that you can't. And being able to figure out which of those are which and just do the best with the things you can control. And like that
Right.
is kind of super self-helpy, I think, in some ways. But it's also just like, it's also kind of obvious in a lot of ways. But it's not always obvious what
Right.
the real ramifications of that are.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about is about that idea of what does it mean, the Captain Picard line from Star Trek that's so often quoted of sometimes you can do all the right things and still fail.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean you did something wrong. That's just called life.
Right.
Nor does it mean that something unfair or something like that. As well as I think there's also a lot of thoughts that I have about why is it that we have so much trouble accepting, again, whether you want to call it randomness or uncertainty or chaos or whatever it is. Let me back up, though, and talk about, because I think we're diving into some of the concepts from poker, but that some people who don't know the game may not understand as much.
Sure.
Because certainly poker is, at least, I don't want to get, there's a whole bunch of debate about whether poker is gambling or not. And poker is distinctly different than most other games at a casino in that you're not playing against a house. You're playing against other players. So, like, if I sit down at blackjack or craps, I can tell myself I have a very good system, but statistically, I am never going to be the favorite. Whereas in poker, like, there's different degrees of that.
Right. Except in blackjack if you count cards and yada, yada, yada.
Right, yeah. And there's ways to work the different systems, etc. Again, no one from any law enforcement agencies, of course, we don't do that. It's not illegal,
that's completely okay. We're just gonna have to blackjack. You're allowed to count cards in terms of the law, but casinos will ban you because they are allowed to. But it's not illegal. Counting cards in blackjack is not illegal. Using mechanical devices and stuff is. But that's a huge like movie pet peeve of mine.
Yes, that's
by
fair.
the way.
But most of the time, they don't show you getting arrested. They show you getting your kneecaps busted.
Right. No, but they also often just say it's illegal. Like they literally say that, and that's just factually inaccurate. So
that's fair. Okay.
Yeah.
But back to the poker point of it, though, in a given hand, you've got certain cards, but at any point, the last card could come out and give someone else the better hand or something like that. How is it that you can actually, like, if there is that much randomness in it, how is it that you can make money at it? Like, you would think that it would be random in terms of who winds up getting different money and stuff like that.
Right. Well, because, poker is a game that combines skill and chance. And most games do that to some extent or another. But, the literal turn of a card is chance as just a pure randomness, right?
Right.
But because there's certain constraints to that randomness, it's not like you're going to suddenly get, the 11 of purple horseshoes. Like, that's not, what cards are in the deck to begin with, right? So the constraints of the game. So you can understand how likely certain outcomes are, and you can take actions that are going to be more advantageous based on what the possible outcomes are, right? So it's like
Right.
you don't know what the individual outcome is, but if you know what cards you have, you know what cards are left in the deck, right? You can know how likely you are to make a flush with one card to come. And if you're putting in, $100 in order to win 200 and there's one card to come and you're trying to make a flush and that's the only way you can win the pot, that's not a good bet. But if you're putting in $10 to win 100, like that's a very good bet, right? So it's basically you can see you're getting odds and you're just comparing what the odds are to you. The actual reality of the situation is much more complicated. But the other thing is that, we have this thing called, you want to...
Yeah, I just want to focus on that first part for a second,
yeah.
because I think that's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that part of the point of poker, and this is, I think, part of a lot of things in life, is that you're not trying to think about any one instance.
Mm-hmm.
Take a situation like what you just described, where I'm just going to make up the numbers to make it roughly easy to understand. You have a 1 in 5 chance of winning, but if you win, you will get 10 times your money.
Right.
Well, if you just sit down and do that 4 times, or even 5 times, or even 10 times, you may well lose your money overall.
Sure.
But if you do that thousands of times,
Yeah.
if you do that and you always do it the same way, over the long run, assuming that the statistics are working as the statistics are working, the deck isn't fixed or someone isn't cheating,
Right.
in the long run, the 1 out of 5 times you get paid is going to make you more money than you lost the 4 times out of 5 that you lost. And so your profit is eventually going to come. And that's what's different. Like, to take the lottery, for example, you could buy an infinite number of lottery tickets and you still would wind up losing because the one time you hit the lottery, it doesn't actually make up for all the other times you could do it. And so that's, and I think that's what you were kind of getting at before about the, like, you do the small things all the time, each time, knowing that, like, that this is about how you think about a repeatable everyday kind of a thing, or, instead of just like the one decision you have to make once with without any repeatability.
Yeah. I mean, the repeatability is a big deal of it, right? I mean, even if you're only doing one thing one time, there's still a concept of expected value, right? Which is essentially the average expected outcome, right? If you took up all of the outcomes and assigned them basically a likelihood of each outcome, and then you figure out the average of that, that's your expected value. And in one instance, it's either probably going to be a win or a loss. And if you're only doing one thing one time, then your chances, it kind of it doesn't function the same way, right? Like there's, when you play enough volume, when you make a large volume of decisions with certain, with positive expected value, over the long run, the likelihood of having a negative overall outcome just goes down and down and down until it becomes vanishingly small. You can be very unlucky, which would be, having negative outcomes for a very long time, like a length of time that's shocking to most people, right? But the longer the time, the less likely it is, provided that you're getting your money in good, that you're making positive, effective plays.
Right. And just to go a little bit deeper on this idea of probability and how this all works, you talked about how the length of time it might take for the numbers to sort of average out the way people would expect is a lot longer than people might think.
Yeah.
And so, for example, in that case of, like, if you're expected to win 1 out of 5 times, it's actually statistically quite possible that you could do that 5 times, 10 times, maybe even 15 times and lose every single time. One of the concepts that people playing poker or gambling or just talking about chance in general is the idea that dice have no memory.
Right.
Talk a little bit about what that means in terms of, like, probability and expectation.
Right. So there's, and this is why you can beat blackjack, incidentally, in theory, compared to a game like craps. So there's the gambler's fallacy, right? Which is, I'm actually not even sure exactly which one it is, but basically, let's just go with a coin, right? If we flip a coin one time and it lands heads, then, is it more likely to be heads on the second flip? Or is it more likely to be tails? Or is it still 50-50? If we assume a fair coin. Well, it's still 50-50, right? Because the coin has no memory. Unless there's like something about the way you're flipping it. And actually there's something about like physics. It's not really 50-50 even with a fair coin. There's a whole thing apparently that's like recently been. But like if we assume just something's 50-50, it happens once, then it's still 50-50. You do it again, it's still going to be 50-50 every time, right? And so that means, the chances of heads is the same as tails is the same as heads tails is the same as tails heads, right? Each one of those has the same chance of being a sequence of events. Blackjack, the reason it's a little different, and I'm not like saying like, oh, go out and learn to count cards and play blackjack. Yeah. Casinos actually don't really mind people trying to count cards because most people are terrible at it. That's right. But so the thing in blackjack is the deck does have a memory unless it's continuous shuffle, because they shuffle the deck, you deal some cards, you deal a hand, and then those cards are dead. So now there's a new state of the deck, right? Like we're playing with a different deck. And I know blackjack usually plays many decks, and there's a whole thing.
And more places are going to continue a shuffle for exactly this reason.
Right. That's just an unbeatable game all of a sudden, right? Yeah. And that's that to me seems like a more honest thing to do than to have a game that is beatable, but then when people are actually playing it, well, you're like, whoa. You can't actually beat this game that we set up and allow you to be able to be profitable in. But most things, like in poker, you play one hand of poker, and then you shuffle the deck. And the deck has no memory. It doesn't remember where the cards are. As long as it's a fair shuffle, right? And, somebody's not putting, an ace on the bottom and then dealing from the bottom or anything like that. The deck has no memory. So each, this is the concept of like independent events compared to dependent events. And if each...
Explain what those mean.
Right. So if each event is independent, it means that the outcome of the first event has no bearing, no influence on the outcome of the second event, right? Like, if you roll 2 dice, there's a 1 in 36 chance that you're going to get snake eyes, right? You're going to get 2 1s. The same as the chances of 2 6s. A 3 and a 4 is different, or it's rolling a 7 is more likely, right? Because there's more ways of doing that. But each roll of the dice is an independent event. Whereas if... trying to think of a good example. There are things that are not as gambling related, but like, let's say 2 people play a game and then you play a second game. You can view those as independent events. And if they're pure chance and everything's truly reset, they will be independent events. But let's say you and I play a game of chess and one of us wins, one of us loses, and then that affects the mental state of the 2 of us, right? That can then make the second game not really an independent event, because the first game, the outcome of it doesn't necessarily directly affect the second event, but we're human, right? And so our ability to play could be changed. Now, largely, I think games played after one another are considered kind of independent events, but they're probably not truly. And if someone wins 5 in a row...
In the card games that I like to play, like Magic the Gathering or Lorcana, often the first time you play, you don't know anything about your opponent's deck.
Right.
So it might be that, like, at that point you're starting at it, but if, like, my deck has more answers to your deck, now that I know what your deck is doing, in my second game, I'm going to be more focused on, okay, I need the kind of cards that are particularly good. So that, I think, is a good example of where, the second outcome is very dependent on the first outcome.
Yeah, for sure. And in poker, the same can happen where the cards, each hand dealt is an independent event in terms of how the cards come out. But as we play, if we're playing heads up, we're gradually learning one another's strategies. And that can affect our own strategies, right? We want to try and make exploits. We want to adjust to the other person's strategy, who's then going to try and adjust to ours. And we're trying to counter adjust. And that makes hands not independent events in terms of the strategical approach, assuming that we're actually adjusting to one another's play. But it does make them independent events in terms of the dealing of the cards.
Which, by the way, I just want to throw in... is why I think one of the most frustrating conversations to me in fandom is when two characters fight, and then those two characters fight again and have a different outcome.
Yes.
Or when, like, character 1 defeats character 2.
Right.
Character 3 defeats character 1, and then character 2 defeats character 3.
Yeah.
When it's like, every fight is not on, like, the number of variables that go into a fight, everything from just the energy level, the power level of the people, how they're feeling that day, how distracted they are, whether they're sick, what, does one of them fight better when there's a lot of, like, rubble around, or, do better when it's all clear ground. Like, there are so many variables that go into these kind of things, and one of the most famous that gets talked about, or one of the ones that gets most infamously talked about, I think, is the fight in which, in Phantom Menace, is the fight in
The Force Awakens?
The Force Awakens, thank you, in which Rey defeats Kylo Ren. And people will often look at that and be like, well, but how could that happen? Because, Kylo Ren beat this other person, all this kind of stuff. When it's like, well, he's grievously wounded already from something that happened early in the fight. Like, that's not a fight in particular. I think this is true in Cobra Kai as well, is not just, this person's a 7, this person's a 6, so the 7 will always defeat the 6. There are so many random variables that are going to be different every time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and within fighting, there's also the concept of matchups where, you can have 3 fighters with different styles, and it can be kind of a rock, paper, scissors scenario where one person has a big advantage on a second person. Like, one person might have really long reach and another person's really fast, and then someone else is big and strong. And, like, the person with long reach might actually be able to keep the fast person at bay, who can then get in quickly on the person who's big and slow. But, like, the person who's big and slow can maybe get past the person with long reach because, like, whatever the person with long reach is using, like, doesn't actually stop the big person, right? Like, this is a super contrived example, but, like,
exactly.
The point is, like, you can have kind of a rock, paper, scissors scenario where it's like, yes, player A has an advantage on player B has an advantage on player C, and player C has an advantage on player A. Not to mention, like, if someone's a 6 and someone's a 7, on a good day, the 6 is better than the 7 because, like, performance is not constant either, right? When somebody's rattled, when somebody just didn't get a good night's sleep, when somebody's injured, there's all sorts of reasons. When
someone's fought 10 henchmen in order to get to the other person.
Right, exactly. There's all sorts of reasons that somebody would be performing at a lower level than their peak, right? And as a result, like, like a 2 probably isn't going to beat an 8. But, like, a 5 can beat, like, a 7 on a good day. On the 5's good day and the 7's bad day, yeah, sure.
So one of the other things that comes up a lot in these conversations is results-oriented thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we see all the time in the kind of stories we're talking about. Can you define that term and what it means both in poker and in larger things?
Yeah, so, results-oriented thinking, like, the purpose of trying to make good decisions is, by and large, to get good results, right? Like, that's a goal, is a result. Or it's a hope. It's a desired outcome. But the problem arises when we choose a strategy that we thought was good, we apply the strategy, and then because of chance, the strategy doesn't succeed. We don't get the desired outcome, right? And then there's a mental decision, oh, well, that wasn't the result I wanted, so that must have been the wrong strategy. Like, as if, you put in $10 to a $100 pot with a flush draw, and you didn't get there, and you said, oh, that was bad, I did the wrong thing, It's like, no, you got a very likely bad outcome after making a good decision. And that's super common. And it's, the good decisions are not always going to get you good results. Like in poker, you can play well and get bad results. You can play poorly and get good results in the shorter term, right? In the longer term, if we're looking at, poker over like a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, 5 years, a long run, tens, hundreds of thousands of hands, millions of hands even. If your results are bad, you're doing something wrong. almost certainly, right? Over a longer period of time, and the worse the results, the more likely it is that you've got an issue in your strategy. And for what it's worth, basically everybody can always be improving their strategies. Like poker and most games, like outside of like tic-tac-toe, usually there's more we can learn, right? And, you know, fighting. So, you know, results-oriented thinking is basically reasoning backwards from, well, this was the result, therefore there was something wrong with the strategy, you know, and sometimes there is something wrong with the strategy, but it was still the right decision because you didn't have the information, right? Like you're trying to make a bluff and it's a totally reasonable spot to make a bluff given what you know. But then your opponent calls you with some hand that seems super ridiculous and you realize, oh, this person just doesn't know how to throw away a hand. They're never folding if they called me with this hand, right? Therefore, in the future, I'm going to adjust my strategy. But that's not because it didn't work. It's because I've acquired new information. And the information wasn't this didn't work. It was this person made some ridiculous call down that now I want to adjust my strategy. There are other hands they could have called with that we'd go, oh, okay, they're supposed to call with that. That doesn't mean this was a bad strategy.
Yeah. And how does that apply outside of poker or outside of games? Right.
So, I mean, outside of games, it's like if you get like, say you're buying a car and you're like, I'm going to buy a super reliable car, right? And you do everything right along those lines and you get a car that's supposed to be super reliable. You get it from, you know, a trustworthy dealer. I'm certainly no expert in this, but, you know, I've bought one car and it's done okay so far. It's a Corolla, you know, and like that I heard from somebody that this was a reasonable car to buy. And like if it had crapped out on the first day, that doesn't necessarily mean I made a bad decision, right? Like it maybe just is super unlucky. And
because just kind of connect the dots here, all that research you're doing is helping it be that like you have an 80 or an 85% chance, or maybe even a 90 or 95% chance to get something that's not going to break down, rather than like the 50% chance or the 20% chance, depending on like how reliable the person you are buying it from.
Right. Exactly. Like with most things in life, there's some chance that there will be some information you're unaware of and perhaps did not have a way of acquiring that information. Now, if you did have a way of acquiring that information, then you can't really use the explanation, oh, well, I didn't have that information. It's like, well, you should have, right? And then you learn that and you're like, okay, in the future, make sure that I check this out. But like you can check all the boxes and then it's just like, you're just trying to maximize your probabilities, right? Like the odds of a good outcome. And sometimes you don't get the good outcome anyway. And sometimes like you do something bad. This is actually a big one, is like somebody makes a bad decision and then nothing bad happens. And so then that reinforces oh yeah, I can keep making this bad decision. You know, it's like somebody drinks a lot and then they go drive and they're like, oh, well, I got home fine. You know?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a big danger with things that have a small chance of going horribly awry. Right. Where everything can be fine time and time and time again. But then like the one time, if you do that one time and say you have a 1%, 5%, 10% chance of something getting in a wreck, right? And possibly dying or killing someone. But like the chances of that worst outcome are probably fairly small. But like if you do that one time, I'm not saying that's fine, but the chances of getting away with it and being okay are much better than if you do it 10 times or 100 times. Or if you do it every night for a year, like if it's a 1% chance, there's a really good chance now over 365 instances, you're going to have a terrible outcome.
Right. And kind of like, that's I think also where this thinking, I'm going to back up a second to kind of make a point here. But here I think is how applying to your life becomes most important. We often talk in poker about having a bankroll.
Right.
Where in that situation, like I said, where you're going to win 1 in 5 times. Okay, so let's say it's a $100 bet. If I have $100, well, I don't have enough to bet enough times that the money's going to work out for me. And someone might say, okay, well, if you have $500, then you're okay. Even then, because like we said, the law of averages, takes a while to catch up. You actually have to have, enough of that bankroll so that eventually the numbers will catch up with you. The idea of, okay, well, I'm going to spend my life savings on one particular bet, even if it's I have a, 70% chance to win. Okay, you may well wind up with a very good situation, or you may wind up, completely and utterly screwed, where the negative result is so big as to say, is it worthwhile a bet? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the kind of thing there where, to me, it's not just that the 1% is going to add up, but it's if I have this very small chance to do something truly and utterly horrible that will end my life and someone else's life, something like that, then again, that kind of the thinking of well, sure, it's not that it's the one chance, it's that even if the small chance, the damage of that small chance happening is enough to say the whole thing isn't worth it or whatever. In the same way of saying, is the chance of it happening make everything worth it? Right,
for sure. One would say that you're underrolled for, such reckless actions because your role is one life, you know. And I think that's a really good example because there's something called the Kelly Criterion, which is a way of basically calculating the largest rational wager you can make given a certain chance of winning and certain standard deviation and yada, yada, yada. It gets pretty mathy. It's actually pretty simple, but we won't dig into the math. But the point is there's ways of, when it comes to purely dollars, right? Purely money, of calculating what is actually a rational amount of your bankroll to wager. But then there's also real life considerations, right? Where, there's some game shows where you can essentially, wager. I think, let's make a deal. I was like, anybody want to make a deal? Who thinks they're smarter than a deal maker? No, let's make a deal. And some other shows where you can calculate, how much money is left out there and your odds of each outcome, right? And if one of, there's $1 million and a $1 there and somebody offers you $400,000, you can look at it and be like, oh, well, but my expected value is $550,000, right? So of course that's a plus EV gamble. I get an extra $100,000, right? Yeah. Compared to just getting $400K. But if you look at it, and let's ignore tax implications and whatever for the moment, but if you look at it just in terms of life EV, basically, it's well, depending on where you are in your life, what is the difference between, $400,000 and $500,000 really 25% of the difference between 0 and 400,000? Right. And for a lot of people, that's going to be no. It's well, with 400,000, I can buy a house, or I can pay off my house, or I can send I don't know, these days, what is it, 2 kids to college or one, or
maybe 1.5,
maybe 1.5, one goes to community college, one goes to a 4-year. But 0 to 400,000 for many/most people is going to be life changing. That extra 100,000, there's diminishing utility, right?
Right.
And so maybe it is rational to say, you know what, I'm gonna take this buyout. As a professional gambler, on some level, I find it appalling, but then I'm no, it makes sense, right? It's fair.
Right.
Whereas if they're well, I'll take 100,000 instead. I'm look, you're gonna pass up $400,000 in EV, but it's maybe that first 100,000 is way more important than the next 400. And so, in poker, there is this desire to lock up the win because there's this dopamine hit. There's this emotional boost from having a winning session. There's there's I don't want to bet too big on the river. You have a good hand, you're trying to bet and you want to get called, but it's the desire, the want to get called is a very emotional desire, right? The rational desire is I want to maximize the expectation of this hand. And sometimes that's going to be a much larger bet that's actually much less likely to get called, but still on average is going to net you a lot more money. Right. And, these are the kind of things that can make more sense outside of the game than in the game. And sometimes you have to ask yourself, within poker, it's well, why am I playing? Is my goal to make a lot of money over the long run? If so, I've got to go for the max EV option, every time. right?
Yeah, and that's a perfect example. Part of why I would call myself the poker hobbyist, because that wasn't always my goal.
Right.
You know, and so for example, like for me, like take the situation where I have a 1 in 10 chance to hit, but if I hit, I'm going to get 20 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
Or even let's say I have a 1 in 10 chance to hit, and I'm going to get 9 to 1. If my goal is to have enough money to keep doing that every single time, that's a crazy thing to do. I should never do that. If my goal is to have a really fun time at the poker table, actually now, because now it's not just the EV of the cash, it's the huge dopamine hit that happens when I do win that card,
right.
particularly if I'm playing against Paul, and Paul goes, "How can you have played that against me?"
How did you make running to
which is
hair?
priceless as a dopamine hit.
Yeah.
But also just like, honestly, that the 3 seconds of anticipation as
right.
I'm waiting for that last are phenomenal. And I was going to say it's kind of like a drug. And
right.
it actually
and
is.
It is, yeah.
Which is exactly why gambling can become an addiction. And so, again, be very careful. Like any kind of thrill-seeking behavior can become an addiction. It's a kind of a form of dopamine addiction, basically. Maybe, I don't know the neurochemistry exactly. But, like, so always be careful about that. But I think that that's another thing where you can say, like, hey, is it worthwhile to do this? You know, and for myself, I didn't always do this when I was young and stupid, but now I will always look at my budget and go, okay, can I pay $300 for a night of like high quality entertainment? Would I pay $300 to go to the theater tonight and to go have a nice dinner? Yes, my budget can afford that. So I'm willing to take the $300 to the casino, possibly lose it all, or get those really fun dopamine hits. But when it becomes, well, I'm playing with my rent money, or even worse, I'm playing with someone else's rent money or someone else's, you know, whatever money.
Or with cash advance off a credit card or something.
Yeah, exactly. And here's where, again, I'll pull it back. One of my frustrations with a lot of superhero movies is I feel like a lot of times they gamble with other people's money, or quite literally with other people's lives.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the conceit, like think about the ending of Avengers 1, where I think the rational EV move is to nuke the city. That and if you assume that the nuking of the city will end the invasion.
Right.
Maybe it won't, but if that's the best information you have, the chance that the Avengers will do it, even if it's like a 60 or 70% chance, the chance that they won't is that the world is now conquered. Mm-hmm. You don't have a bankroll for that. That is
right. You're underrolled.
Underrolled. So, like, I'm not saying that therefore, like, they should have nuked it or Nick Fury was wrong, but I think that's a level of thinking that I think we don't do in our own lives enough, and that people because, I mean, watching a person do the exact same thing 10 times, fail 9 times, and succeed in the 10th, does not make for good TV. Does not make for a good movie.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they have to do that. But that's why I think it's so important to understand that kind of thinking of, yeah, actually, sometimes the rational thing to do is is not to take the big risk, because you got to think about like what's the fallout of the big risk you're taking not playing out, and particularly, and here I think is the biggest conceit of superhero movies a lot. If the reason that you think it is not a big risk is because it's you and you know you can do it, that's a problem.
I mean...
Well...
Yeah. Well, it can be a problem.
Yes, yeah.
I'll give you it can be a problem.
Yes. There are people who know they are that good.
Yeah.
I would say the number of people who think that they are that good
dramatically outweighs the number of people who actually who think they are, yes. Who actually are, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot there. One, in terms of nuking the city, why couldn't they just nuke through the wormhole or whatever? Wouldn't that be the actual rational? Like, wait a minute. Why don't we do what Tony did?
I feel like if there's any birth to this podcast, other than the fact of the like Team Tony versus Team Cap debate that we've been having for literal decades now, it's the number of times a character in a movie has had a choice, and you and I have been like, wait, but what about this third option?
Yeah, what about the third way? Like, why not that? Oh, I was forced to do this. It's like there were other options there. If you just give it a moment. But, and then that brings up people are acting under pressure. And, when we're looking at poker decisions, like, we also have to understand, like, I can sit down and analyze a hand for literally hours, but let's say, a tight 15 minutes. And it's like, you don't have that at the poker table, right? You're making a lot of decisions quicker. But the thing that you said that I most wanted to respond to was kind of about, I think it's super important if you play poker, if you do any kind of gambling that's less skill-based, right? Anything that involves wagering. But, I mean, really, you can expand this to be true for, like, pretty much anything in life, but especially things that have a substantial, sort of cost, risk-reward, cost-benefit analysis. Is, like, just have a good idea why you're doing what you're doing,
Yeah.
Are you going to the casino to play poker because you want to, like, play poker for a living? If so, you need a bankroll. You need a certain amount of money that is really just poker related, and you have to do a lot of math to basically understand, like, well, what's my expected win rate? Like, what should I think it is? Like, what are the chances that I'm going to go bust over this period of time? If I play these stakes, should I play these stakes? Yada, 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 right? Whereas if you're playing either purely recreationally or, the kind of semi-pro kind of like, well, I would like to make money from this game, but I'm not, if I lose the money I have allotted to it, that's not a big deal because I have, another income. Then you need a budget, I think. Even that sort of semi-pro, I think it's not really a bankroll, it's a budget, and you can say, okay, right, I'm going to play 2-5 because I think that's the best game for me, and I have $1,000 budget a month. Like, that's a large budget, for something that is entertainment. But if you're like, well, but it's going to be profitable entertainment, and on any given month I might lose, but, like, in the long run, I think I'm actually going to have more money, and worst case scenario, I have a good time. But to, like, have that budget and be like, yeah, when the money's gone, it's time to go home. That's it. The game's over. And, having, like, okay, my budget this weekend is $300. Then you choose the game accordingly, and if you're comfortable with, like, yeah, I can get it in on a long shot, and if it hits, I'm going to be super excited, and if it doesn't, that's okay. And, then I'm just going to go do something else. That's cool. Like, that's the fact that people enjoy doing that is one of the reasons that people can make a living playing poker, because there are people who are playing just for enjoyment and are fine with the fact that it's like, they want to try to be a favorite mostly, right? Like, most people playing poker are trying to win, right? But, like, are okay with not, like, maximizing every spot and maybe making some calls that just seem fun. And as long as you have a concept of, like, okay, what's the cost of this if I lose? It's like, well, the cost is literally the money, and then however you're going to feel afterwards, right? And then there's the upside, and that's the money and however you're going to feel afterwards. And if those things balance out to you, then cool, do it, And if they don't, then don't. And if you have an issue with it, if you're developing an addiction, and then, seek help for real.
Yeah, definitely. This is a topic I think we're going to come back to a bunch of times. I want to transition us into cognitive dissonance, because that's kind of, I think, one of the biggest ones for me in terms of this. And give a definition of that term, because then there's a couple of specific ones I want to talk about.
Right. So this isn't a definite dictionary definition, but basically cognitive dissonance is like the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts in your mind at the same time, and essentially think that they're both true, even though they're not, right? That, like, they can't be.
Right.
And this is, I'm trying to think of a good poker example. I feel like you had something in mind, so why don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the poker example, but I think a life example that can often be true is, for example, depending on your state of mind, you might be more likely to remember success or more likely to remember failure. And so it might be that, I take that 1 in 5 chance 50 times. But because a lot of time, 7 of those times, 10 of those times, it doesn't work out. What I remember, it does actually work out from time to time, but I just remember all the times it didn't work.
Right.
Or on the flip side, like, actually, it didn't work all those times, but thing is, when I go to Vegas, I don't tell the story of when it didn't work out. I tell the story of when it did. And I remember when it did. And so part of to me, the thing that I'm getting at here is that one of the things I think that we find hardest to understand about probability, and it's particularly around like randomness and chance, the human brain is very, very good at finding patterns. Mm-hmm. That's an essential part of evolution. We were able to understand, like, okay, as it gets hotter, like, these things happen to the plants around us. These things happen to the animals around us. These things happen to the water around us. And, like, like thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years ago, before we started having, like, what we understand as quote-unquote civilization, humans and our, nearest ancestors were able to discern patterns about the world around them and be able to learn things from them. The problem is that our brains are so good at finding patterns that we absolutely hate the idea that things don't have patterns. So we look for patterns. So we look for, I always win, or even more often, I always lose. Mm-hmm. We look for, and this is where it comes into other parts of life, it's always when, like, I go up against this other kind of person that I lose, or this other kind of person always seems to be the one who gets hired for the job instead of me. Right. Or, this other kind of person always seems to be the one that the professor, gives a good grade to, or whatever it is. This is a whole other range of things we can talk about, but I kind of want to start it there about the idea of, like, the human brain's desire to find patterns even when they're not there.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, I think I completely butchered the definition of cognitive dissonance, but I think we're talking more about confirmation bias here.
I guess I thought of confirmation bias as a kind of cognitive dissonance, but we can get away from the exact terms. So.
Sure. But, like, the idea being that there's some random selection of data, right?
Right.
And we look at these truly random occurrences and seek to find a pattern, right? Because the brain wants a pattern. And because when you can find a pattern, when there really is a pattern and you can discover it, that can be extraordinarily powerful, right? For instance, if we're playing poker, to bring it directly to poker, and you make this tiny bet at the end, and I call you, and you have a very marginal hand, right? I'm like, okay. Then you do it again, and I call you in a very marginal hand. Then you make a big bet, and I call you, and you have a big hand. And this happens enough times, we could say that I found a pattern that, you bet small with small hands and big with big hands. And that's super useful when you're playing poker for this called a bet sizing tell, right? I mean, similarly, you could have a big hand and be like, want the cookie? I brought props.
For people, no one's watching it because we have
nobody's watching.
So this is not on video. Paul just did the thing with an Oreo cookie that John Malkovich does in the movie Rounders.
So, having an actual physical tell, right? That's a pattern. That somebody does something physical, and that corresponds to them having a certain type of hand. Right. And that's very useful. However, if you're like, 2 7s came out, like, on 3 different flops today. 7s are hot. Like, there's totally a pattern. Every 5th hand, we get 2 7s on the flop. Now I'm going to play deuce 7 offsuit because, like, I'm probably going to make 3 7s because there's a pattern, right? It's like, no, those were random events. Those were independent events, probably, unless someone's cheating, unless something's rigged, which I think we always have to acknowledge our uncertainty about, like, there are certain conditions that could be different from what we're expecting, but those generally are very unlikely. And so those patterns can be super valuable if they're real and you observe them and then you adjust accordingly, but super dangerous when, if you're thinking, maybe 7s are hot, and then they come out again, it's like, that's it. That's the thing, right? And that's where confirmation bias comes in. Because it's like, every time it happens, the brain's like, yes, I found a pattern. Good brain. You know, and every time it doesn't happen, it just, you know, it just kind of floats through unobserved, unremarked upon. And so there's this fixation on, you know, the data that confirms our assumptions. And that's something that's very real throughout all sorts of, you know, aspects of life. But, you know, in poker specifically, like it's, and all sorts of life, like it's really important to observe, right? And once we're aware of our own biases, it's easier to then kind of counter adjust for them, right? Be like, okay, I tend to think somebody always has the goods when they bet. And so now I'm going to be like, okay, I have this feeling of fear. Now I have to be like, okay, but that's my bias speaking. Now let my rational mind come in and analyze the data that's like real. And maybe I'll still come to a conclusion. I think they have a strong hand. But maybe I won't. Maybe I'll go, you know what? I'm really not so sure about this. This is my bias coming into play. And I mean, in other areas of life, I think it's more important, right? To be able to be like, no, you know what? I have a bias against people with this or that, you know, aspect or whatever. Like I have a bias against frat boys, and like, you know, like I'm friends with people who went to frats, like not a lot, but like some, and like, I don't, on a deeper intellectual level, like I have huge, like, I think legitimate complaints about the whole fraternity institution, right? But like, in terms of just individual people, like I know if I see someone and I think they're like frat related, like I'm going to have an immediate kind of negative reaction that then I have to actually override and be like, okay, this is just a person. Like, let's just approach them as a person, knowing that this one thing about them is true, but that doesn't define who they are, you know, and, you know, other people have some other biases that are maybe more pernicious.
Well, and that's the next thing I'll talk about, because I think it becomes super important to remember to find your own biases and where are you like taking note of the information that fits your bias, but ignoring the information that doesn't. But also, what's the bias of the information that you're perceiving?
Sure.
If you grew up at the time I did, and you watched the news in the 80s, a lot of biases that people drew were that gay men in the 80s were all having crazy sex orgies with each other all the time.
Right.
That's because HIV/AIDS was a huge problem, and there were gay male bathhouses and things like that, although a lot of people were very safe in those bathhouses. A lot of people were not. But the point being that if you didn't know someone who was gay, the media stories about HIV spreading through anonymous gay sex was probably the main thing you heard about gay men.
Yeah.
And so that's the bias you were fed. In the same way, you know, when all of your depictions of Mexicans on TV and movies are as drug dealers or as other kind of, like, that's the bias that you're being told. And this, I think, becomes really important as we analyze the movies we look at, because you're right. You know, and I also think it's I also have some philosophical problems with a lot of things about fraternity systems, but I also know that the stories that I hear about hazing at fraternities are the most extreme examples, and that most fraternities probably have much milder hazing that no one ever tells me about because it's not newsworthy, you know? And I have the same bias that you do. And I think that's another point that becomes so important, is being able to remember, like, and I think this is so true, like a lot of the stories I think we see are often about, you know, people from like warring planets or warring nations or, you know, warring groups or whatever, who have these biases about each other, and can they actually see the evidence of things that are not fitting the bias, and often the heroes are the ones who can and the villains are the ones who can't. Yeah. And it's not that clear cut, and I think a lot of times we're critical of heroes because they can't, or we're critical of writers because they can't.
Yeah.
But I think that's where it becomes a really important thing, is like, how can you break out of that confirmation bias to see the information that's in front of you?
Yeah, for sure. You know, it's like if you are fed one of these biases or acquire one through some other means, and then, you know, you meet 5 people and one of them matches the description, like, it's so much easier to have the one that confirms that bias just be the one that like comes to mind, you know, and to kind of just be like, oh, but those other 4 were exceptions. Like, what? You know? And I mean, I'm actually reminded of the D&D movie, which I won't say too much about, but like, you know, there wasn't a ton about biases, but you know, there's at least 1 or 2 things. And, you know, at least 2 of the heroes is like about, you know, they have certain biases against certain other heroes. And then they're like, I think one of the things that makes them heroes is that they do overcome those. And they're like, you know, let's actually judge this person on their actions, not on what I know about people from this place or of this species or whatever.
Right.
Or race in Dungeons and Dragons terms, you know, which is different from Earth race, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Let's talk then about what I think is often the corollary to this, the concept of blame. Mm-hmm. I think about this very much because of the current state the United States is in right now and a lot of the world is in. One of the things that is very linked to finding patterns is finding cause. Mm-hmm. And you know, I haven't studied neuroscience at a academic level, but I've certainly read a lot about it and observed a lot about it. And the thing that I've learned from so many others who have studied it is that there is the idea that something, the kind of old joke of like shit happens, that's incredibly hard for our brains to conceive of. Our brains really don't like that and want to come up with something. What has poker kind of taught you, or what do you think the kind of the ideas of poker can translate to this? The idea that like when bad things happen to us or people we know, we want to find someone to blame.
Yeah, I think, I think it's a huge issue in life, you know, but to go specifically with the poker of it, I think losing a big hand, you know, making a bluff that gets called, betting large for value and then the opponent folds. Like there's this like, well, what did I do wrong? Why didn't this bluff work? You know, right. It's not supposed to work all the time. Like, why didn't my value bet get called? It's not supposed to get called all the time. You know, how come I made a call and then they turned over a better hand? Should I have called this or should I have folded? Like, you're supposed to call and lose sometime. This is how the game is structured, right? You're not supposed to only make perfect decisions. The only way to do that is if you can literally see your opponent's cards, which, you know, is cheating. So don't do that. And, you know, you're supposed to be wrong some of the time in terms of getting the desired outcome. And that's different even from just chance, right? In terms of a card to come. That's like, we don't know our opponent's cards. We have uncertainty about the situation, and we made the best decision we could with the information we had available at the time, right? Yeah. Poker is a game that relies on each person has their own private, hidden, secret information, and then there's public information. And we need to combine the things that we know that are factual about the, you know, the cards that are out, what the action sequence is, who bet, who raised, stuff like that. And we need to combine that with, you know, thinking about, well, what could they have? What would they have played this way? And then we just do the best we can. And I think a lot of times people do give their best effort. They make reasonable decisions and things don't work out. And there's well, what did I do wrong? Like, did I deserve this? Or, oh, well, this didn't work out. It's totally unfair. It's not my fault. Right.
Right. The dealer must have cheated. Like.
Right. You know. Or like just it's injustice. Like a flush draw shouldn't have got there. I had the best hand. I should have won. It's like, no, it's supposed to get there sometimes. Sometimes even 2 flushes are supposed to hit against you in consecutive hands. You know, that's a thing. And so I think this idea of either there's the 2 extremes of wanting to take ultimate responsibility for every outcome, which is unhealthy. That's results-oriented thinking, really, right? And never taking responsibility for any outcome and being like, well, I always play everything perfect and the world's just out to get me. You know, and the truth of, you know, the best approach is it's hard, right? It's like we need to take responsibility for our decisions and our actions while also understanding that they were made without perfect information about the world and with the understanding that there's going to be some element of chance. And good decisions aren't automatically going to result in good outcomes. And bad decisions don't automatically result in bad outcomes. and just like trying to evaluate our decisions on their merits and based on what we knew at the time. And then as we acquire new information, then being like, okay, I'm going to use that to inform my future decisions without beating myself up about my past ones, but while also being realistic about, oh, did I have some information I was overlooking? Was I focusing on the wrong information? Maybe.
Right.
And that...
So, go ahead. Finish.
That just makes poker a very difficult game to learn because you don't get pure feedback on like, oh, you did good, it worked. You did bad, it didn't work. And I think life's a lot of like that too, right? There's so many things you can give a great effort and it just doesn't work out. And vice versa.
So, there's two things I want to say here. One, just on the limited information. In poker, you do not have to... You get to the showdown where there's no more betting and everyone's supposed to show their cards. And I think everyone's used to the kind of movie idea that everyone shows their cards.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, in poker a lot of times, especially at casinos or the kind of like higher level things, once someone shows a winning hand, other people will throw away their cards and never show them.
Right.
So someone might say, every time I see their cards, they beat me.
Right. Yes.
Because yes, they only show you, like you only gain that information in the situation. And so that's the bias. But the larger thing I want to get there is, because to me, that I think is the
That's a really good
soul
point, though. I want to underscore that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's again about like thinking about when are you getting information and when are you not.
And you're getting information the other time. You know they had a worse hand than you had. Or than whoever whatever won. But it's hard to record that.
Yeah, you have to put that in your mind as one of the times you saw their cards.
Exactly.
You saw
that you knew something about their hand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the other part of it is, because to me, I think this is the thing that I think most applies to our own lives, to our own society, and to the questions that so many of these movies and TV shows that we love bring up, which is that, like, all that we are getting at is we want to find a reason why things happened.
Right.
And, like, one of the things that I remember when one of the times where I'm sort of like, I wasn't like paying all my bills. I was getting like scholarship money and stuff, but I was paying my like, day-to-day money by playing poker when I was in grad school, when I was in seminary. And I was sometimes do my homework at the table. And so people, you're mostly playing with a lot of the same people if you're going 3 days a week. People learned that I was a seminarian. And every now and then someone would come over and be like, hey, can I talk to you for a second, buy you a cup of coffee or something and chat a bit. And they would start telling me about like their experience of God or their religious ideas. And I was like, okay, sure. You don't have to tell me this. What it would get at, though, is that they were having a lot of what they understood as bad luck. And one person literally said this, and other people said it in some other phrase, but they said, why does God hate me? Why doesn't God ever let me get the winning cards? Why does God always make the other guy win?
Right.
And to me, and this is also about psychology as much as anything else, one of the ways in which I think this can happen is we'll start to blame ourselves. And we'll start to think either A, that like some supreme power is mad at me, or just the like, oh, I'm so terrible. This I often see a lot of times in like, I'm in a lot of like polyamorous websites and discussion groups, and a lot of times guys will post about like, oh, I must be so terrible, like no girl likes me. I keep sending these messages and I never get responses. And the fact is, like sending a anonymous message to someone, or like, with your name, but like you never had contact with them, the EV on that is just about zero.
Right.
Because it might be that like you could write the 3 most romantic paragraphs of a dating site instant message, but if that person has already gotten 8 dick pics and 4 things, they may just delete your message or may just never see it. Like, there's so many other factors. But where I'm getting to with all this is I think that this feeling, I think, is one of the most dangerous things of not understanding probability, because either A, it can really turn to a place of self-hate and like, oh, the whole world hates me and I'm so depressed. And then it becomes like, recurring cycle, and like, you can kind of make your own truth. But once you're in that place, you are now incredibly vulnerable to someone else coming along and saying, no, I'm so sorry you feel this way. It's not your fault. It's their fault. And the different racial group, or this, it's because women are so terrible, or because blacks are so terrible, or because, the deep state has done all these things, or, any of these things. And if like, this is so often the the villain origin story.
Right.
Is bad things happen to them, and then either their own confirmation bias or someone else, like, giving them confirmation bias, tells them,
biased
no.
confirmation.
Yeah, this isn't your fault. This is all the fault of the Jedi. This is all the fault of the Avengers. This is all the fault of, well, generally it is always the fault of Tony Stark, so that's not really a confirmation bias.
I thought you were going to say Jedi, but either way.
But yeah, I think that's, to me, that's almost the most important thing I want people to get out of this, is thinking about it in those terms, because I think that's where, honestly, so many of the problems we have in our society come from, is bad things happen to people. And sometimes it is just random. Sometimes it is like, I do think often big business and like the current economic structure and the patriarchy and things like that are much more to blame. But like, blaming the patriarchy versus blaming like 6 individual people, patriarchy is such a large, amorphous, like, what the hell do we mean by that? What do we mean by big business? What do we mean by, the force? It's much easier to have a specific group you can look at and point to and that you can hurt.
Yeah, in the poker game of life, the patriarchy is the fucking rake. Just reframing Worm's iconic, but not, super.
And I will say, given the misogyny of the original statement, that is actually the perfect way of flipping that on its
Thank you. That was quite deliberate. Which was actually the real life Kanish is the one who actually said that, Joel Bagels. But it's hard because I do think people want things to happen for a reason, and I think a lot of things don't happen for a reason. All of those organizational things, like, legit are the rake, like, right? Because like the rake, which for those who aren't versed, the house runs the game, right? They ensure, or hopefully ensure, a fair game where everybody gets 2 random cards or however many random cards, and the cards come out fair, and everything's, all the betting takes place according to the rules. And then they just take some of the money. I have some random other phone going off. I apologize for that. I don't know where it is either.
I can't hear it, so don't worry about it.
Good. I found it. I'm turning it off. Okay, so basically the house takes a little bit off the top, and they never lose. I mean, they might actually lose money overall because they have to pay the dealers and they have to keep the lights on, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. They don't make a ton of money off poker. They would just put in a bunch of slot machines. A lot of places they do. But the point is the house just takes money out of the game, and then the players are left fighting for what's left, right? I think this is like a kind of good metaphor for like the vulture class and all this kind of whatever. And, and some people are going to profit, but the average person is going to lose. Like, actually, most people lose in a game with rake because a lot of money just comes out of the game. Right? Like, it's people talk about poker being a zero-sum game where somebody wins, somebody loses, somebody else has to win. But it's actually negative sum once you account for the rake, unless you think of the house as a player. So, that's a tough situation where you basically have a bunch of people fighting against each other in a spot where everybody on average, if they're equally pitted, are expected to lose, actually, right? But I think in life and with poker, like, really it's just, you do want to hold yourself responsible for your own decisions, right? Your decisions, your actions, those are things you can control. And within poker, as long as you're acting within the rules, it's like, that's fine. You're supposed to be trying to beat the other players out of money, right? But in life, maybe we actually can play a positive sum game. That's a thing. But a lot of things just happen, and I mean, I'm not going to challenge people's metaphysical beliefs necessarily. Like, you can see it however you want, but I'll share mine, which are basically things. The world is how it is. People do what they do. Animals do what they do. Comets follow their trajectory. Like, things happen, and most individuals are not in control of a very large number of things that happen to them. And right, we don't get to choose our starting spot in the world. You know, we only can decide how we proceed within the context that we exist, and dealing with things that happen that are completely out of our control is, I mean, at times overwhelming. You know, for me, like the hardest thing is like people getting sick and dying. Like, I don't like it. You know, like, I don't think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, no, that's cool. You know, but I do think people often try and come up with ways of finding like a reason, or like
God called them home, or it was their time, or it was justice. You know, they shouldn't have lived anymore. You know, either way.
Yeah. And that I would say never really resonated with me. You know, as someone whose father died at the age of 41 when I was 8, like I find that point of view appalling from my point of view. You know, if that's your point of view, that's your point of view. I'm not telling you should think it's wrong. I'm just telling you, you know, how I feel. And that, you know, if you really think about like everything in the world, it is kind of like, really, this is all exactly how it's supposed to be? Like, you know, but it's how it is. This is how it is. Right. And then what's left to us is to decide, how do we want to respond to how the world is? You know, can we make some changes? Can we work with other people to try and create a more positive sum game, you know, outside of the poker table? And I mean, poker, you know, from a financial standpoint is a negative sum game when it's raked, right? Or a zero sum game if it's unraked. That doesn't mean it can't be a positive sum game from a life EV standpoint, right? Yeah. Like, as you alluded to earlier, stated outright, like, the money changing hands is not the entirety of the game, right? There is the intellectual challenge. There's the social aspect, which I think is primary for a great number of people.
I mean, even you, who plays poker professionally, tomorrow night, you and I are going to engage in an online game with a lot of our friends who we haven't seen in a while, who we like talking with. I'm almost positive that you're probably you are far and away the best poker player at that table. I would also imagine, though, just given the small amount of hands that will happen, the amount of extreme randomness from some of the crazy plays people play, but also just the stakes, you would have a higher monetary EV spending that time playing poker the way you normally do.
Absolutely.
So, and it's...
I'm playing for fun because it's a lot of fun to sit around with friends and play a game I love. Like, and in that context, actually, the poker is less fun for me than the poker that I play more seriously, but the experience is more fun because the conversation, right? And catching up with people that I haven't talked to in a long time. And so, you know, for people, their Thursday night poker game or just going to the casino, honestly, my 2 favorite places I ever played poker, aside from like home games or something, you know, and maybe there's a third one that's kind of tied, but like the Mayfair Club in New York, it was the same people all the time, you know, and I was like 21, 22 and like, you know, hanging out with people of all ages. I mean, almost all older than me, but like of all walks of life. And it was just super fun. Like having this place to go and like feeling this sense of like kind of belonging and just, it was a nice community for the most part, you know? And then more recently, Grayton Casino in Northern California, in Rohnert Park, north of, in the Bay Area. And I knew everybody there, you know, I would go in and be like, oh, hey, how's it going? You know, how's the 1-3? Oh, it's a good game. Okay. Yeah, I'll hop in that. Oh, the 2-5's really good. Oh, okay. I'll play that one, you know? And it's like, people who I knew that I was like there to make money. Like that was my primary goal in going there. But it was also always a social experience as well, and hanging out with people I knew, and the combination of those things, especially for a lot of online poker players, where the pace of live poker, where you're playing in person, is so slow. Like you'll get maybe 30, 35 hands an hour, whereas online I can get 300, 350. You can play over 1,000 hands an hour. The interacting with people, you know, it's the upside and the downside. Some of the people sometimes, you know, it's like, I could do without. But overall, it's like there is this additional aspect to the experience that can make it in life EV, you know, a positive sum game collectively.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's such a good point. And I think that's a good place to wrap up the main part of the discussion. There's one more question that I want to ask you that I think I'm going to give you a chance to talk about for just a few minutes now, and I think primarily will be what our bonus section is about for members. By the way, I should have said this from the beginning, but if you want to support this podcast, if you like what we're talking about, for only $5 a month, you can become a member. You get bonus content at the end of almost all of the episodes. You get free bonus episodes. We're going to be starting those in the fall. And also you just get to help support us. We're using that money to help get better sound equipment, do a whole bunch of things to improve things, really make it possible for us to keep bringing you this content. So, Paul, in terms of probability and particular polling, if something should happen 75% of the time, but the other thing, the thing that was only supposed to happen 25% of the time happens, doesn't that mean that 75-25% thing was wrong?
Oh, yeah. No, that's a terrible prediction.
Give me...
that was sarcasm for the uninitiated.
Yeah, the reaction to the 2016 polling and then election is kind of the thing that I know Paul has talked about this the most with, but I want to give you a chance to, because I think one of the other human fallacies that we can do is if we know that something is 80%, sometimes it's like if we think something is 55% likely to happen, but even if it's 80, 90, 95% likely to happen, when it doesn't happen, our reaction isn't, oh, well, that should happen every now and then. Our reaction is, that's wrong. It must have been fixed. It must have been broke. That couldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Talk about this. Give me your rant.
Yeah, I mean, it's absurd as, like, flipping a coin twice and it ends up tails twice, and you're like, that's it, rigged. This was an impossible outcome. Like, literally, that's a 25% chance, assuming a fair coin. And, like, I mean, that happens a lot. Like, just think about it. Like, you roll a 4-sided die, right? It's going to land on 1, 2, 3, or 4. You probably had to play D&D to, like, picture a 4-sided die. It's a little pyramid. But, like, and they're actually, honestly, it's funny because a 4-sided die is really easy to kind of rig because they don't tumble quite the same. But, like, that's exactly what it is. And I remember during the 2016 election, people talking about, first of all, Nate Silver of 538, professional poker player who turned baseball forecaster, who turned political forecaster, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's important to remember that those are forecasts. They're not predictions. And I think the Huffington Post had Clinton at like 99% or something. And then 538 had Clinton at like 63% maybe just before the election. And I think people looking at that were like, oh, okay, good. She's going to win. And like, that's just a really inaccurate assessment. That would be like, well, okay, you only have a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying from the flu, right? So clearly nobody ever dies of the flu. Like that would be, because that's even less likely than the 27. Like that doesn't make any sense. You know, if something's 27% likely, it's going to happen about 2 times out of 7, right? Like that happens. Things that happen 2 out of 7, like somebody who hits like 286 in baseball, like they get hits. They don't bat 0. They're not like a pitcher hitting, right? 286 is actually pretty respectable these days.
But what that means is that like you're getting a hit 29% of the time, rounded up.
Sure.
And sometimes that person will get a hit. They'll go 3 for 5 in a game.
Right. That'll happen.
And if you actually think about the statistics, that shouldn't make sense, but actually it does totally make sense.
Right.
A, because it is entirely statistically possible. B, because, and I think this is very true about polling as well, but other things, like, that doesn't mean 29%. It means that, like, it's going to be that, you know, if that's like 1 out of 14, or I don't know how the numbers would be,
4 out of
that it's going to be like 13. It's because there'll be a bad hitter and they'll get a couple of hits, and then they'll have a couple of 0 for 5 days, and like et cetera.
Yeah, I didn't know when you wanted to do the break or whatever. I can ramble. I've been known to.
Give us like the bullet points, and then we'll talk about them more in the member section.
Yeah, so, I mean, the main thing is just that, like, something that's unlikely isn't something that won't happen. Like, you have to understand that something can be fairly unlikely. Like, I'll just give you a hand of poker to illustrate. This has happened to me 4 times, I think, in my career now. A hand similar to this. I have pocket aces. This is the best hand you can have in Texas Hold'em. I raise, they re-raise, I re-raise. The board comes out ace 9-4. I have 3 aces. That's the best hand you can have on this board. I bet, they call. The next card's a jack. They check, I bet, they raise, I raise, they raise. The river's another jack. So I have aces full of jacks. The only hand I can lose to is pocket jacks. And of course my opponent has pocket jacks. And the chances of them catching 2 jacks on the, one on the turn, one on the river, is roughly 1 in 1,000. It's 1 out of 990. And I've had this happen 4 times, this 1 in 1,000 chance. Do I think I'm cursed because some 1 in 1,000 thing has happened to me 4 times? That would be like dying of the flu 4 times. No, I don't, because I've played millions of hands of poker. And it's not like that should happen 1 out of every 1,000 hands. No, it should only happen 1 out of every 1,000 times that a scenario like that extreme occurs, which isn't that often. But, when you have a lot of instances and things like presidential elections, you have 1 every 4 years, right? So whatever the actual outcome is, you're only getting 1. It's like you don't have a big bankroll of like presidential slots, right? Like your roll is 1 per 4 years. It's a small budget. So, it's like people, even a forecast that said 99% something was going to happen. Well, that 1% means we're not saying that can't happen. We're saying, it could.
Right.
It could happen. It's pretty unlikely, but it could.
And if, 4 days in a row, they say something is 99% likely to happen, and it doesn't happen any of those times, okay, maybe you start to ask about, is that person very good at their job of forecasting? But even then, 4 is not actually a very high sample size. So we're going to get into a lot more of that in the bonus section. For now, though, Paul, for people who want to find... actually, do you want me to do where to find you? Or
that's fine.
Let's actually do that, because you have written books about poker and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into all that more in our member section. Again, become a member, only $5 a month. Very easy. All the information is on our website. Also there is all the ways to contact us. So please do that. But Paul, you have actually written a number of books about poker. If you want to find those, please let us know.
Yeah. So I'm listed as, I'm Zen Madman on all the like social media stuff, and I have a Zen Madman Poker YouTube channel. But my first book was Way of the Poker Warrior. It has some dated language in it, and some dated poker advice. It was from 2010. That was my first book. It's available on LeanPub. And then I wrote a couple with Dusty Schmidt, who I had a bit of a falling out with after we had some political disagreements, you could say. But we wrote Don't Listen to Phil Hellmuth, and another book that was called Critical Concepts, but I think got retitled like How to Crush No Limit Hold'em or something ridiculous like that. Both available from Cardozo Publishing, I believe. And then I've got some, if you just search for Paul Christopher Hoppe on, your least favorite bookseller online, I've got some like low content poker books as well, and some fiction and whatever. But that's the poker content I have available at the moment.
And what I'm going to do is, if you want to find better ways to help support this podcast, I'm going to, any of those that we can, I'm going to put links to all of those on our show notes, and those that you can buy through booksellers and things like that, we'll put an affiliate link. The information will be in the show notes. You may have to use a specific affiliate code, but that way, Paul will get full money, but we'll get a little bit back to help support the podcast. I'm also going to do that with the movie Rounders. If you haven't watched that, you probably can find, I'm certain you can rent it through Amazon. We have an affiliate link with them, so I'll get you a way to do that. Even if you don't care about poker, it is a phenomenal, phenomenal movie. But it is just, from
a poker standpoint, it's almost the only good poker movie.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
Is how I would say it.
Which is, I'm sure we're going to return to this topic, especially based on feedback, and that'll be a bonus content for some other episode. But today, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about probability.
Cool.
So on behalf of myself and Paul, thank you so much. Please give us our feedback. Chick.
Keeps check. All night. Check.
That's it.
Trap
all night. Actually, wait. I'm going to take it one more time.
Am I supposed to respond?
No. You can respond as much as you want. No, that's not why.
Pay that man his money.
Yeah. So on behalf of myself and Paul, thank you all so much. Does this look like a man beaten by jacks? We've spoken.